100 years ago, there was a new poem published, first in the Criterion magazine, and then the Dial magazine, and then as a book. The book came out in December 1922. So it's been about 100 years since this poem came out, and if you don't know already, the poem I'm talking about is The Wasteland by T.S. Eliot. It's a poem that remains one of the most puzzling, most praised, and sometimes most criticized poems of the modern era. If you've never read The Wasteland and want an excuse to do so, or if you've tried reading it and found it confusing, difficult, even ridiculous, then this video is for you. You don't need to know a lot about Eliot to read the poem, but a couple details could be useful. So T.S. Eliot stands for Thomas Stearns Eliot. He was an American by birth, and he moved to England to pursue a career in literature and banking in the early 19-teens, just before World War I. He studied in both England and France. He was a voracious reader in the literary traditions of Europe and Asia. He loved Sanskrit and ancient Greece as much as he loved modern French, German, English. And he was interested in myths, especially myths that grounded cultures and religions the world over. He also, as I mentioned before, had moved to London just before World War I, and he got to see the grief and devastation of war between the German Empire and England and France. He worked on The Wasteland for a long time and got a lot of advice from his friend Ezra Pound, Virginia Woolf, and others. The poem that he ended up producing in fall of 1922 was unlike many that anyone had ever read before. The Wasteland is a poem in 5 parts. Most of these parts are just a few pages long, except for part 4, which is only half a page. It used to be a lot longer, but Ezra Pound, a very critical editor, told him, you gotta cut it way down. And Eliot obeyed. The parts of the poem all have names, and the names are all pretty ominous. The Burial of the Dead, A Game of Chess, The Fire Sermon, Death by Water, What the Thunder Said. As you can see by these titles, Eliot's interested in really big ideas, most obviously death, but also in the elements, fire, water, thunder, earth. A Game of Chess kind of stands out among these because it sounds odd. Games like chess are creations of human culture. What is something like chess or human games? What does that have to do with gigantic phenomenon like death and flame? Well, if you wonder, welcome to the questions Eliot wants you to ask. In fact, one of the best ways to begin enjoying a poem like The Wasteland is to begin comparing the diverse images and voices that meet in the poem and asking, what do these things have to do with each other? Why are they next to each other? How do they illumine, complicate, or even mock one another? So let's look at the opening lines, which I'm going to read to you. It's very easy to find The Wasteland. You can find it on poetryfoundation.com or other places. I want to read just the opening stanza or so and think about how we can start interacting with this poem. The Wasteland, Part 1, Burial of the Dead. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. Summer surprised us, coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain. We stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. So these opening lines are curious. This first line, April is the cruelest month, is very famous. Now, it's interesting. Most people just quote the first part of the first line, April is the cruelest month. But actually, the whole first line is April is the cruelest month, breeding. And if you want to start looking at patterns in this poem, which seems to jump around from scene to scene and even language to language very quickly, we see a pattern established and then varied very early on in the poem. April is the cruelest month, breeding. Lilacs out of the dead land, mixing. Memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. So this opening 4 lines, or quatrain, create a pattern and then break it. The pattern that they create is ending with these participles, breeding, mixing, stirring, and then in the 4th line, we end dull roots with spring rain. And so we create a pattern and we vary it. Now that might not sound terribly interesting, but in a poem like this where it can be very bewildering to figure out what's going on, these are our anchor points. If we keep reading after the fourth line, we see that we get back into the pattern of ending with participles. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. So we get back to two participle ending lines, and then it's broken again with a little life with dried tubers. These first 7 lines kind of create this opening image. It's an image of April. It's an image of April thinking back to winter and how April and the spring that's taking place is changing the winter. Now, usually, typically, when we think about winter, we think of being cold, we think of things being dead, and we think of spring as something that renews and is beautiful. And immediately, Eliot subverts that. He says April is not the most beautiful month or the most verdant month. April is the cruelest month. And then when he gets to winter, he says, winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow. The snow isn't something that freezes and kills us. It kept us warm. We were safe. And now spring is this inconvenience. It's very curious in these first 7 lines that expectations are subverted. Finally, we have then, in the last 4 lines I read, a vision of summer. Summer surprised us. Coming over the Starnberger See with a shower of rain, we stopped in the colonnade and went on in sunlight into the Hofgarten and drank coffee and talked for an hour. When we get to summer, it becomes more conversational, and we see that we're actually in a German setting. The Starnberger See, the Hofgarten. This almost sounds like a chatty German aristocrat telling you what they did last summer. Whereas in the opening lines, it's a little bit more of a prophetic, ruminative, poetic voice that then changes into a more like, oh yes, this is what we did last summer. These changing of voices are going to be another thing to pay attention to as you read through The Wasteland. Who is talking? Now, of course, it's not like a guessing game where we have to say, oh, technically this is the Kaiser talking. It's not that specific. Eliot wants us to think more about what kind of person is talking. If April is the cruelest month breeding lilacs of the dead land is the voice of this prophetic poet, he wants us to then think, oh yes, a German aristocrat is now chatting with us. Why might that be important? Well, wasn't the German aristocracy and monarchy pretty involved in the war that just devastated Europe? And what does it mean that we now have this reminiscences of summer in Germany? How might that resonate with this feeling that when spring comes, the land still isn't over being traumatized? And maybe that winter, when we were able to sleep, it helped us because we didn't have to think about the trauma in the land. These are the kind of questions that I think we can ask of The Wasteland, and that I hope you'll think about as you read through it. Thanks for hanging out a little bit, letting me introduce The Wasteland to you. Pick it up and read it. It's been about 100 years since it was written. It's one of the most important poems of the 20th century. It's challenging, and it's okay that it's hard to figure out. Like I said, it's not a guessing game. It's a poem where we need to think about, what am I seeing, and how does it compare to the thing I last saw and the thing I next see? And I think you'll get some real interesting meditation out of it. Thanks. I've been Dr. Timothy Bartell. I'll see you next time on Knowing Poetry.